Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is Kayla and today I'm going to be doing a book review on Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now I say Bram Stoker, but I think you're supposed to say Bram Stoker, but I think it's just the way I talk. So Dracula, I'm going to do a book review on Dracula, which is kind of a big deal because it is a classic. And I've tried to read this a couple of times. Over the years, I've tried to read it a few times, but I could never get into it. And honestly, I don't think I got past like the first 15 pages because I was really confused about what was going on. I had no idea what was going on. It was really hard for me to like understand. I couldn't like grasp like any imagery. It was really hard. It was just really hard for me, and I just was like, what is going on? Well, and I mean, of course I have a kind of rudimentary understanding of what Dracula is about. You know, it's about Dracula, a vampire who is kind of like the father of all vampire stories. It's Dracula. So I really wanted to read it. I mean, and it's a big book. Look at this puppy. It's huge. And also, can we just take some time to appreciate this gorgeous book? Look at this. It is so beautiful. Oh my god. I love that. I mean, I don't know what this version is called or anything like that, but it's the cover and stuff, like the binding, it's kind of like rubbery, which I like. And I actually bought a few books that are like this, but I just thought it's so beautiful. I have a deep love for classics, so I know I'll keep this forever. And I just thought, you know, a visually beautiful book always helps me get into a book, always. So, I mean, I love that the pages are like black, right? And that's so cool. And then of course, like the inside, it's just kind of like your normal, I don't know, it's just beautiful. It's a beautiful book. I decided to read it finally, and honestly, this actually took me a while to read. This took me about a month to get through. It is 500 and some pages. Oh wait, no, it's not. Well, in this book, in this version, it is 399 pages long. And it's big. It's a lot. It's a huge book. So then when I bought this, and then I thought, you know what, I really want to tackle another classic and kind of, you know, put forth my best effort and really finish it. You know, just keep going, just keep going, right? So I did. And I'm really glad that I did. I'm very glad that I read this finally. It's kind of cool because I have an appreciation for vampire stories. I do. I love a good vampire story. And I mean, as we all know, with books and with movies, there's so much vampire lore. You know, there's so many different kinds of vampire histories and vampire powers, you know, and like how you turn a vampire, and like it's kind of different everywhere, you know, like in the show Buffy, or in the Twilight series, or Interview with the Vampire, or True Blood, or I mean, you can name a gazillion more vampire stories where, you know, they're all slightly different, but they're all pretty cool. I mean, and what I love about Dracula is this is basically where it all began, which is pretty fascinating. I mean, there were some tales of vampires before, you know, Bram Stoker got a hold of this, of this material, but I don't think it was ever in like a book form or like a fiction form. So he's definitely the first to do that. So I mean, he didn't literally create the whole vampire myth and stuff like that, but he put it together, and he kind of, I mean, honestly, everything else is like inspired by this. It's based off of this. It's inspired by it. It uses, you know, I don't know. It's like, this is like the birth, and everything else came after it, which is really cool. It's really fascinating. And so I thought, you know, I've read a lot of vampire books, and I've seen a lot of vampire movies and shows and stuff like that. And I was like, you know, it'd be really cool to finally read where it all began, you know, and kind of add that to my, you know, my knowledge, I guess, of vampires. So I thought, this is so cool, you know, I can't wait to read this. And so I read it, and it's a lot, it's different than what I thought it was going to be. I kind of thought it was going to be, I mean, I knew it wasn't going to be like a page turner like books are today, because this was published in 1897, and so I mean it's an old book. So I mean, and it's a classic. So these books are written differently for a different time. So I mean, I went, you know, I started this knowing like, okay, you know, it's not going to be like watching, you know, True Blood today. It's not gonna be like that exciting or whatever. But I did kind of expect there to be more Dracula. It's weird. It's I'll go into it. But first I'm just gonna kind of give like a little summary and just kind of like a few like sprinkling of things. I don't want to really do any spoilers in the beginning, but this video will have spoilers because I want to talk about the book. But I'll put a timestamp and all that jazz. So, Dracula. So it was published in 1897 by Bram Stoker. And one thing I didn't know is that Bram Stoker is Irish. He's 100% Irish. He was born in Dublin, I think, which I did not. I mean, I knew this book, at least part of it, took place in Transylvania. So I don't know why I kind of always thought like, oh, you know, Bram Stoker is like from that area. No, he was Irish. But so I thought that was kind of interesting. So yeah, this was published in 1897, and it is another interesting thing about it, which I didn't know, is that this is what is called an epistolary novel, which means, once I Googled it, because I didn't know what that was, what it means is that the entire book is written in a form like diary entries, letters, newspaper clippings, things like that. So the whole thing is written from several different points of views of characters, and it's like letters and journal entries and just all kinds of stuff like that, which I didn't know it was going to be like that. I thought it was going to be kind of like your run-of-the-mill fiction story prose, but it wasn't. And I think that's why I couldn't get into it in the beginning, is because I didn't know. I was expecting like just a fiction book. I didn't grasp the idea that it was going to be told solely through like diary entries, journal entries, letters, stuff like that. So that was interesting. So that's kind of an interesting thing about this book. And one thing that I heard, because after I read this, I did a little bit of research about it. And some people say that they think one of the reasons why he wrote it that way is to kind of he thought that maybe if it was in the form of a bunch of letters and diary entries and stuff, that would make the tale of Dracula feel more real and authentic. So it's kind of like an old version of a found footage film, you know, like the films that they make that's clearly, it's fake, but it's in the form of like found footage, so it seems real. And I think the first found footage film was the Blair Witch Project, at least one of the big first ones. And I remember when I was a kid, I really thought that was real. Like I thought that really happened. So I mean, it has a certain effect. So they think that that's why, that could be a part of the reason why he wrote it that way, which makes sense. Like that's kind of cool. Especially because when this was published, I mean, vampires were not known the way that vampires are known now. Like there wasn't, like people didn't know about vampires. This is completely new. I mean, there was probably whisperings of it here and there in certain places in certain countries, but it was nowhere near like how it's just in, you know, the media and stuff, not the media, but like movies and books and shows, and it's like, it wasn't like that. So this is really new. So I can see how this would be really cool in the sense of someone picks up this book, they read it, and it's like, oh my God, is this a true story? Because it's like people's journal entries and stuff like that. So I guess that was one reason why it was written that way. So it kind of is about Dracula. I mean, I kind of view the book in like 3 sections: the beginning, the middle, and the end, and they're all very distinct to me. The beginning, we are actually quite very close to Dracula. We meet Dracula pretty early on. We kind of converse with him and stuff like that. So I mean, for the first third of the book, in the way in my head, it's really kind of like what you would expect, I guess. So that's really cool. But then in the middle, it kind of just like drops off, and then it goes to like it goes to London, and for the most part you start getting introduced to new characters, and it's like these 2 women who are friends, and they're writing letters to each other, and like weird stuff's going on. And then the third part is when, you know, this group of people is actively going after Dracula. God, I'm really sucking at this. I'm really sucking at this. I wonder if I can just read like the Goodreads thing. Like maybe that'll help, because this is what Wikipedia says. It says, Dracula is an 1897 Gothic horror novel by Irish author Bram Stoker. It introduced the character of Count Dracula and established many conventions of subsequent vampire fantasy. The novel tells the story of Dracula's attempt to move from Transylvania to England so that he may find new blood and spread the undead curse, and of the battle between Dracula and a small group of people led by Professor Abraham Van Helsing. So yeah, that's pretty much what it's about. So it was good. It was good. I'm glad I read it. I have a deep respect for it because of the fact that it's a classic, because of, you know, at the time it just was like whole new material, you know, something that no one's ever written before. And then also everything that's come after it, everything that's been created because of it. Like that's so cool. And so in my opinion, that makes this book really important, really valuable to, you know, society and literature and stuff like that. So I mean, I have a deep respect for it. So when it comes to Goodreads, and after I finished it, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I'm really glad I read it. And I'm, you know, I think everybody should read it, especially if you have any kind of interest in fantasy or vampire at all. Like, it's just a cool thing to read. And it does help you get a kind of understanding of vampires in general. So it's really cool. But in spite of all of that, I will say that this was really hard to get through. It took me a month to read. There were a few reasons why it was hard to get through. One of them is because it's huge. Okay, it's a classic. So it's written... There are some good portions of this book that I feel were very unnecessary. Like, just there was way too many explanations of things that I just really didn't need explanations of. Like, it was one of those where, like, they'd explain, you know, the train station schedules and, you know, how they traveled from one place to another, and, you know, things that they did. First we did this during the day, the second we did this. Like, there was good portions of the book that I'm like, I don't need to know this. Like, this is not important to the story at all. Like, I don't care that, you know, I don't know. There was just parts that I'm just like, this is so not necessary. So that was a little irritating, but kind of not surprising when it comes to a classic. I also fell asleep reading this many times, and it's not saying that the book or the story itself was like boring or bad, because it's not. For the most part, I really enjoyed the storyline all throughout. I really did. But like I said, it's just one of those where it's just not a page turner, you know? It's not a sit up, you know, straight dive in, kind of like I gotta know what's next. Like, it really wasn't, like maybe 1 or 2 parts, but it didn't last long. So, I mean, it was a real struggle to get through. Like, it just was. I hate to say that, but it's the truth for me. But like I said, I'm glad I got through it and everything like that. But it has its issues, in my opinion. I also think that despite the fact of how great a novel this is, it's not necessarily like writing wise or like, I don't know, professional writer wise. It's not, it has some pretty big issues in my opinion. I heard, now I'm not entirely sure because I did not pay that close attention. I guess I could go back and really search, but I guess that there's a lot of inconsistencies in the book. I guess because this was written several times, there were several drafts, which is normal. I mean, that's just normal when you write a book, but things changed a lot. And so like something that's said in the book at one point is kind of contradicted later. And then there's also a big traveling time issue where like he would say like, oh, you know, I gotta go from London to Amsterdam and then back to London, and it's like it'll take me this many hours or this many days, and like that's actually like physically impossible. Like it's not that possible to get from this place to this place in less than a day, and like all this other stuff. So I guess with stuff like that there's inconsistencies, but I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't think that would fly today, but I mean, whatever. Like, I don't really care that much, but it's just kind of a funny little thing, a fact about this book. Also, my arm was hurting carrying this big brick of a book. There were just times where I felt like something that happened in the book was just way too convenient. You know, like, it was so obvious that it wasn't, there weren't many smooth transitions. There were times where something would happen and I'm like, oh God, you know, it's just way too convenient for the characters or, you know, for the progression of the story. So, I mean, that seemed a little amateurish. One of the things some people kind of notice and have issues with is that the way that people are journaling in this book, I mean, it might as well be like word for word. It's kind of amazing, like the entries that they're like, they remember entire conversations, because what they're doing is like they experience something and then like later that night they journal about what happened. But instead of kind of journaling the way you would normally journal, it's very word for word. They try and get so many facts or like word for word. It's just crazy. It's not very believable or realistic in that sense, but also Bram Stoker makes sure to cover his bases when it comes to trying to make it as believable as possible. So like one of the characters will be writing in their journal and be like, because of this and this, I'm gonna, from now on, I'm gonna write every single thing that happens, you know, and then you're thinking like, okay, you didn't need to tell me that. Like, I know what you're doing. Like, it's very obvious that he stuck that in there so that it's not weird to the reader. Like, why is this person, you know, recording things the way prose is almost? Because a lot of it is written prose-like, but in journal form. It's weird. Or letters. So, I mean, there are definitely issues with this book. This book wasn't exactly what I was expecting. I was expecting to kind of this book to be way more about Dracula, way more involved with Dracula, kind of like, part of me kind of thought we were gonna like go along with Dracula and kind of like be in his head and be from his point of view and stuff like that. But then when I started reading, then I found out it's an epistolary novel and that it's, you never hear from Dracula. There are only, you know, diary entries, letters, and all this stuff from a certain amount of characters. And Dracula is not one of them. So that's kind of like I kind of didn't like that. And then, like I said, Dracula appears in the very beginning of the book. It feels like for like most of the book, he's not even there. Like he's way in the background. You know, it's not about him, but it is, but it's like he's not really there. And then in the end, he's still even kind of not there. Like, there are very few scenes where a character is like one-on-one with Dracula. So that's kind of weird. It's weird that like a book called Dracula feels like it's like he's not even there. It's strange. So I I think I would have liked it better if we had followed Dracula, if we had been with Dracula, but that's not how it's written. And then also it's there's this cast of characters that, you know, when I went into reading this, I thought it was going to be about Dracula, how he became Dracula, his lifestyle, and then his demise. I mean, I honestly wasn't sure how the book was going to end, but I kind of assumed it was going to be a bad ending for Dracula. So that's kind of like where my mind went. But it's not that at all. Like, once I finished reading it, I realized this book isn't really about Dracula in that way. It's more about a group of friends, their friendship, their bond, their bravery, their courage, the trials that they've been put through, and how they stick together, and how they, you know, do whatever they can to, you know, destroy Dracula. So that's what it's about. And I was like, oh, okay, I mean, sure. So the first person we're introduced to is Jonathan Harker. He is a solicitor, which I'm thinking is a lawyer-ish, kind of. And he's traveling to Transylvania because he is going to meet with Count Dracula and at his castle, and he's going to finalize and help Dracula with some paperwork and stuff like that, because the Count is going to be coming to London, and so he bought some land, or he bought a house in London, and so he's like finalizing this with Jonathan Harker and whatever. So when we first meet Dracula and they first meet together, Dracula is quite charming. He's quite charming. He's very kind, very polite, very hospitable. Just seems like a really great guy. What is cool though, is from the very beginning, there is this creepiness, you know? So, I mean, there is an aura, there is a mood that is creepy and very Dracula-esque, which I wasn't disappointed, which was kind of cool. So, and also just a side note, I really didn't expect this book to be scary or to be like, I mean, my fear and scariness expectations, my horror expectations were pretty low, because it's a classic and it was written or published in 1897. So, I mean, like, okay. But anyways, that catches me by surprise. But anyways, so they meet, whatever. Well, things slowly start to get weird. So Jonathan Harker is only supposed to be at this castle working with Dracula for like a few days, and then he's supposed to go back home, and he's gonna finally marry his fiance Mina, and you know, live happily ever after, whatever. Well, you know, things start happening where Jonathan Harker's, he's kind of delayed. He kind of has to stay there a little longer. He's kind of spending a lot of time with Count Dracula, and they're conversing a lot, and just, you know, things are just taking a little longer than usual. But then Jonathan starts to notice weird things. So, like, he starts to notice that Dracula never eats. Like, Dracula will bring Jonathan Harker his food, his meals, whatever. And then Jonathan be like, aren't you gonna eat? And he's like, oh, I already ate, or I'm gonna eat later, or just stuff like that. So, I mean, it gets a little weird. And then Jonathan starts to notice that in this giant castle, there are no servants. Like, nobody. No servants, no butlers, no gardeners, like, nobody. And he kind of, like, alludes a few times, like, you know, are your maids gonna clean this up and blah blah blah, and like Dracula was really good at kind of like deflecting So he was tricking Jonathan, you know, and so Jonathan slowly starts to realize, and while he's like journaling, that things are getting weird. Things are getting weirder and weirder. He's starting to feel stranger. He's starting to feel like he's going crazy, and he's starting to feel like he's seeing things, because he kind of is. At one point, he sees Dracula crawl out of a window and like scale down his stone castle like a lizard, and just weird things, you know, and it's stuff that to me now in 2020 feels very cheesy vampire stuff. Like, as soon as he met Dracula, you know, Dracula is not attractive. He's an old man, and he's described pretty ugly in my opinion. But he also has like these long, pointy fingernails. He has like blood red lips. Sometimes his eyes look like they're blazing red. His teeth are like real white and real sharp. So I mean, it's just like, over here I'm just like, okay, obviously he's a vampire. But to people who are reading this who have no idea about vampires, they probably are like, what the fuck is going on? I don't even know. I don't get it. So I had to kind of keep that in mind, like, okay, this is obvious to me, but it's not obvious to people, you know, in the time in which it was written. I mean, weird things happen with Jonathan, and we start to see that that Dracula starts manipulating Jonathan into writing letters that are not true. Like, write a letter to your boss, write a letter to your fiance, and say, okay, you know, I'm leaving on this date, on this train to come back home, blah, 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 but it's not true. And so I figure like, okay, you know, Dracula is, in my opinion, Dracula has been drinking from him and getting stronger, but Jonathan's getting weaker, and he doesn't remember these things. And I think it's because Dracula's like mesmerizing him or whatever. So I'm thinking, okay, Dracula is gonna kill Jonathan and gonna go to London, right? Well, as things are really coming to, I mean, at one point Jonathan tries to escape the castle and he can't. Doors are locked. It's very confusing. He starts second guessing himself all the time and thinking he's going crazy. And then like all of a sudden it just stops. It just stops. And it goes to a whole nother place, whole new characters, and I'm like, what the fuck happened to Jonathan Harker? So I was like, okay, I don't know, but we'll see, right? So I'm like, okay, so now you're in this little town. I want to say it's called Whitby, and I think it's in England, and you are introduced to Lucy Westenra, and Mina. I can't remember what Mina's name is before she marries Jonathan, but I'll just call her Mina. And they're friends, and they're kind of like living in this area right now, and they take walks and they sit in this cemetery on this like bench because it's a beautiful view of like the bay, I think, or some water. And so we get introduced to them. And then Lucy, she gets 3 guys propose marriage to her all in the same day. She really only loves one of them. So the 3 people who propose marriage is Quincy Morris. Quincy Morris is an American. He's a Yankee. He is from Texas. So stereotypical, you know, American at this time and even today. It's really funny. So Quincy Morris is an American, right? Cowboy. And then there's Dr. Seward. He is a doctor, but he runs an insane asylum. And it's kind of like his house / insane asylum. He's a doctor. He has patients. Really good guy. I mean, all of these guys are really good, right? And they all are like really in love with Lucy. So he proposes, and then the third person is Arthur. I can't remember what Arthur's name is. Because for like a while he's called Arthur something, but then his dad dies, and then Arthur becomes a lord. He, you know, inherits his father's title. So then the book no longer refers to him as Arthur. They start referring to him as Lord Godalming or something like that. Lord Godalming or something like that. So Lord Godalming, Arthur, is the person that Lucy really loves. So So Lucy accepts his hand in marriage, and it's wonderful and blah, blah, blah. All the other guys are like sad. They're super sad that, you know, she didn't pick him. So then Lucy's real happy. Everything is fine. But then weird stuff starts happening with Lucy. Lucy starts getting sick, and she starts looking worse every day. And then she starts sleepwalking, and like Mina is like writing in her journal, like, it's weird, like all of a sudden she started sleepwalking and I couldn't find her, and I'd have to, you know, drag her away from the bedroom window at night and close the window. And, you know, they would talk about how there's always this bat, this big black bat that's like fluttering around the outside of the window. And of course me, I'm over here, I'm like, oh my god, it's so obvious, it's Dracula. But they don't know that. I mean, it's not obvious, but it is to me. At the same time that this is happening, Mina is constantly trying to get in contact with Jonathan Harker, because she's like, he's supposed to be back now. I haven't heard from him in weeks. No matter how much I write to him, he doesn't respond. And so she's scared, she's worried, but at the same time she's trying not to be worried, because she knows all kinds of things could have happened. And so she's just kind of busying herself with her friend Lucy, you know, and what's going on with Lucy. Also, at the same time, Dr. Seward, the guy with the insane asylum, he has this interesting patient called Renfield. This guy's weird. He is a strange bird, and he eats bugs, and he has like a weird like idea of how his logic is strange. I mean, he's insane. But like he'll catch flies with sugar, and then he uses the flies to like lure spiders, and then he like uses the spiders to like lure rats or something, and then there's like cats, maybe birds. I mean, it's just like kind of like a food chain. And then he eats the flies, and he'll eat like this, I think he eats the spiders too. I don't know, this guy's crazy. And in a lot of Dr. Seward's journaling, he's kind of like talking about his patient and how weird it is and blah, blah, blah. So that's going on at the same time. And then all of a sudden, Mina gets a letter. I don't think she gets a letter from, she doesn't get a letter from Jonathan himself. She gets a letter, I think, from a nun in some place. And they're like, we have Jonathan. He's super sick. He had a brain fever. You know, you need to come as quick as you can. So then Mina's like, Lucy, I love you, but I gotta go. And Lucy's like, girl, go. And so Mina goes and, you know, is with Jonathan and kind of helps nurse him back to health. They get married right away, because she's like, they're both terrified that like he could die or something bad could happen, and they just want to be together. And so at this point, Jonathan is like, everything that happened to him was like some bad dream. He was super sick. He probably imagined it all, but he still wrote it all in his journal. And he kind of told Mina, he was like, I don't ever want to read this journal. It like really disturbed him. Don't read it unless, you know, you really have to. And so they make this promise and whatever. So then they get married, whatever. Great. But then something happens. I can't remember what it is, but Mina has to read the journal. So Mina reads the journal, and she finds out everything that had happened to Jonathan while he was at Castle Dracula. And I think after she reads this, it hurts her heart, but I think she at this point still thinks that it's not real, that it was some kind of horrible delusion and whatever. So she's just more concerned about getting Jonathan back to a good health and stuff like that. So that's them too. Meanwhile, in Whitby, Lucy is getting worse and worse. And it gets so bad, and like to the point where Arthur, her fiance, calls his friend, because like they all know each other. So Arthur calls his friend Dr. Seward, who is the insane asylum guy, and he's like, you're a doctor, I know what happened, you know, I know she turned you down and stuff, but you're my friend, I trust you, can you please come and look at her and help her and let me know like why she's sick, blah blah blah. So Dr. Seward comes, and he kind of sees all her weird symptoms, like how pale she is, she's got these two like puncture wounds in her neck, and like she's real drowsy, and like the sleepwalking, and like all these weird things that we know is like, okay, she's suffering from blood loss, like she's close to dying, you know. And so he tries to help her, but things don't get better. So then he's like, okay, I need to call my friend, somebody I know. His name is Dr. Van Helsing. He's kind of a weird doctor. He's not your typical doctor. He kind of does kind of like different medicine, new medicine. And if anybody can help, it's him, because I trust him with my life. And so Arthur's like, yes, please go get him. So then Dr. Seward is like, hey, and this doctor, his name is Van Helsing. And he's like, Van Helsing, can you please come over here and check out this friend of mine? And he's like, of course. So Van Helsing comes and he checks out Lucy, and like, it's so irritating. This is probably the most frustrating part of the book for me, is the middle section when all of this is happening, because there are so many times that miscommunication is the issue for the book, or for events that are happening in the book. So if there's so many times that Van Helsing just keeps his mouth shut, and instead of telling people this is what I think it is, he's just kind of like hinting, and he's like trying to lead his friend Dr. Seward to like, this is a vampire. Like, for some reason Van Helsing knows all of this. He knows, he has heard about vampires, he kind of believes in them. Everything that's happening to her is showing all the signs, and so he keeps like hinting and trying to like test Dr. Seward, and like, and instead of, and I'm just thinking, just tell him what you think. Just tell him, I think it's a vampire. This is what I've heard, blah, blah, blah. But he won't, and it's so fucking irritating. And I'm just like, oh, this is one of those writing tools, practices that I hate in a book. So that was frustrating. But basically, finally, no matter what they do, Lucy ends up dying, because everything that they try, things happen, which is just ridiculous. Some things are just ridiculous that happen. And Lucy ends up dying because Dracula keeps coming back and keeps sucking more of her blood, and she ends up dying from it. Well, then they find out that, and I think based on like her journal, because she was journaling after this last incident with Dracula, she journaled, and then like she was sick for a few days, and then she finally died. So I think Van Helsing figured out that not only was a vampire sucking her blood, but he made her suck his blood as well. And according to Van Helsing says like, you know, and eventually he tells Dr. Seward, this is what I think is happening. And Dr. Seward's like, you're fucking crazy. There's no way. And then Van Helsing has to spend some time like convincing him, and then finally, the only way he can convince him is to show him that Lucy turned into a vampire. Because then all of a sudden in this town, children started to go missing, but then they were found like wandering around with 2 punctures in their neck, and they kept saying a blue fur lady kept luring them away, and they wanted to go with the blue fur lady, which I guess is their like accented way of saying beautiful lady. So I'm just gonna pause here and say that there are a few times in this book where there are disturbing, creepy, freaky, fucked up things that happen in here that I'm like, oh, I am surprised that this was written in 1897. I was shocked to read it in here. I'm like, I mean, yes, of course, this isn't like super scary book, but there were some things in here where I'm just like, oh, I did not think that was going to be in there, you know? And this is one of them, you know, the idea of this woman, you know, stalking at night, and for some reason only like luring children to go with her, and she's like sucking their blood. But thank God it hasn't gotten bad enough to the point where she kills any of the kids. So I mean, thank God. But it's creepy. Like, that alone is so fucked in the head. I'm like, ooh, that's creepy. So that's one section. Van Helsing shows Dr. Seward that Lucy is a vampire, right? And then they're like, okay, we have to convince our other friends that this is what's going on. So it takes a little bit of time, but they finally convince Arthur, which is Lucy's fiance, who's heartbroken that she died, and Quincy Morris, the American, that she's a vampire. They literally they see that she's a vampire, and they believe, right? So it's so sad, but Van Helsing is like, okay, we have to kill her, because, you know, she's no longer Lucy. She's this demon. She's this devil. She's the undead. And you have to kill her, because otherwise her soul is damned. And if you kill her, the real Lucy's soul will go to heaven and be free and stuff like that. So Van Helsing convinces her fiance to, like, finish her, which is kind of sad, but at the same time, he's like, who do you think she'd rather do this wonderful thing for her, like set her free? She would want it to be her fiance, the person who loved her most, and so whatever. But so what they had to do was they had to, like, stake her in the heart, and I think they actually used a stake, and then they had to cut off her head. And then she officially, like, dies as a vampire, and then she, like, her soul goes to heaven or whatever. After this happens, which is crazy, Van Helsing's like, all right, our job isn't done. Now we have to go after the source, which is Dracula. They all figure out that it's Dracula that is doing this. And they do this in several ways. I mean, when Jonathan and Mina come back, they all figure out, like, what happened to Jonathan is kind of the same thing that's been happening to Lucy and to some people around town. And so they're like, this is one and the same. And then Jonathan's like, holy shit, everything that happened to me was real and stuff. So these people band together, and they, like, the last part of the book, the last third of the book, it feels like, is all about them coming together, you know, doing everything they can to find Dracula, to hunt him down, and to kill him, right? And so then at one point, you know, Mina ends up being the target of Dracula, and Dracula does the same thing to Mina, where he sucks her blood for a few days, I think, and then he makes her do it. And so she's kind of slowly turning into a vampire, and if she dies as a human, she'll definitely turn into a vampire. And so now it's, like, even more reason to go after Dracula and to kill him. They do all kinds of crazy things. They end up chasing Dracula back to Transylvania, and then, you know, it's this dramatic ending that's feels kind of all of a sudden, and they get a hold of his coffin, you know, before it gets nighttime, and then they stake him and cut off his head. But they don't really stake him. They just, like, get him in the heart with a knife. But, you know, and then that's the end. And then because he died, then Mina was okay, and she was no longer in danger of becoming a vampire, and everyone lived happily ever after. Although Quincy Morris did die in the scuffle. Of course, I am very much glossing over a lot of this, because a lot of, like, little things happen and whatever. But that's the book, okay? That's the whole of the book in a very rushed way. As I was saying about the creepiness factor of it, there were a few things that were totally weird and freaky and creepy. So one of them was the whole Lucy, you know, luring children and sucking their blood. Like, that's fucked in the head and creepy. Another one was in the beginning of the book, when Jonathan is at Count Dracula's castle. There's a point where he meets three ladies, and they're vampires too, and they're, like, very, like, seductive and, like, attractive and stuff. And then they're, like, about to suck Jonathan's blood and probably kill him, and then Dracula bursts it through the door and is like, do not touch him, he's mine, blah blah blah. And he has this, like, sack, and he throws it to the women, and he's like, here's your dinner or whatever. And based on the description and stuff, you realize that there's a baby in this sack, and that he literally, like, kidnapped a baby and threw it to them to eat. I mean, oh, how fucked up is that? I was like, what? Oh, that's disturbing. And I remember thinking again, like, ooh, that's creepy. Like, I didn't expect that to be in Dracula. So that was another one. The gore, I didn't expect, like, the whole stake. I mean, I did expect the stake through the heart, but, like, cutting off of the head, that kind of surprised me. I don't know. There were a few other times where I was just, like, pleasantly surprised that there was some decent gore, and, like, there were parts where I was creeped out. And I mean, I thought it did well in that respect concerning, I mean, despite the fact that it was written so long ago and everything like that. So I mean, the whole story itself was actually a pretty good story. in the end, I did love the fact that it's kind of about this group of friends, you know, who go through many hardships together and they overcome evil, you know, and then there's a happy ending. So I mean, it kind of like warmed my heart in that way. Granted, I was irritated through a lot of the book because there was way too much I don't know what you'd call it, way too much like ego fluffing, like constantly Van Helsing and all of the men were constantly saying how wonderful Mina was and how she was such a wonderful, pure lady, you know, she was just perfect, and they would bow down to her and hold her hand. Like, it was very dramatic, very like, I'm like, oh my god, I rolled my eyes a bunch of times because I'm just like, seriously. And so I mean, in many ways they're very heroic and like, I will die for you and for each other, and like, so it becomes quite dramatic, and part of me is like irritated by that, and part of me was like, whatever, it's okay, I kind of dealt with it. Overall, like I said, I'm glad I read it. I don't think I'd read it again. There's also another issue that kind of is irritating, is this whole, you know, purity versus not pure. You know, all the vampires and stuff, they're all described as being not pure. And like the women, once the women become vampires, they become voluptuous and sexy and sexual, and it's viewed as like a real bad thing and gross and stuff like that. And I'm just over here like, okay. But, you know, when Lucy and Mina are alive as humans, they're these pure, angelic, perfect women. And I'm just like, that's not, it just, I mean, I understand, you know, the time period and stuff, but it was very much this sexist kind of purity thing. It was irritating. That was a little irritating. Oh yeah, the other scary part that was like, ooh, nicely done for a horror novel, was the rat scene. So at one point when they're in, I want to see the Carfax house, and they are hunting down all of his coffins, basically, that are filled with his dirt from his country, and that's where Dracula can sleep. There's this scene where Dracula finds out that they're doing this and they're trying to destroy his coffins, and he gets pissed, and so he like calls up all the rats nearby, and like this scene is disgusting, of just this room where it's just being filled with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rats just coming at him, and it's like, oh, it's really gross. I was like, see, this is horrific. Like, this was, even today, people would be really freaked out and grossed out by that. There, in the book, there was a mentioning of the Death's Head moth. I was like, where did I hear that before? And it's from The Silence of the Lambs. So this is page 294 in my book. I kind of loved that, and it made me wonder, like, the guy who wrote Silence of the Lambs, I'm like, did he get this little, like, inspiration from Dracula, the Death's Head moth? I don't know. Oh, so I guess this is something that Renfield says. And I was like, oh, it's creepy. So I thought that was kind of cool. What else is there to say? I'm glad I read it. I think it is cool to know where this came from, you know, how it all started. There's also a part in this book where it alludes to who Dracula had been when he was human. And there's a possibility, like a little tiny allusion, that he might have been Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, who was a real person. And then somebody else. There was also like, oh, he might be somebody else as well. I've actually never watched any of the Dracula movies, like the very, very original one that came out in like 1920s, and then the one with Bela Lugosi, and then Dracula 2000. I honestly haven't seen any Dracula movies, which is kind of interesting. I think I said everything I wanted to say about it. I don't think I'll read it again. I have a lot of respect for it as a classic. I'm really glad I read it. I think everybody, you know, if you're a classic person and if you like paranormal and vampire stuff, I definitely think you should read it, because it's so interesting to see what started it all. It's kind of cool in that sense. That's Dracula. Hell of a book. It was hard to get through. I need a break from some classics. I'm gonna read something else that's not a classic. Let me know if you've read this. What did you think about it? You know, what were your favorite parts? What parts made you crazy? So yeah, that's about it. All of my, you know, social media is in the description below. My Instagram, my Twitter. Like and subscribe if you liked this video and if you want to see more, because I review books and I do book hauls and I just like talking about books, and that's life, man. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.